Hi, I'm Amit Etkin. I'm a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. I'm the founder and CEO of Alto Neuroscience, which is a precision psychiatry drug developer, developing new drugs for patients with a range of psychiatric disorders, focusing on tools, biomarker, brain-based tests to identify which of our drugs are the right one. I'm also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for One Mind, and today it's my pleasure to be joined here by Dr. Claudia Lugo-Candelas. And in fact, the work we do, and I'm sure the kind of work also that motivates you, is clinically relevant research. So tell me a little bit about your background.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for having me, for that introduction. So my background, I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I think I've always been drawn to really understanding the early development of disorders in children. I want to intervene so that I can prevent disorders from coming on. And the majority of my work centers around the prenatal period, because that's sort of as early as one can think about when you're thinking about a child's risk for developing a disorder. So that's my sort of general spiel.
So you got a One Mind Rising Star Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Tell me in very broad terms what the aim of this award is, and then we'll dive into some of the specifics of what you're after.
Yeah, so very generally, what we're trying to understand is when you have a person who've experienced adversity during their childhood, there seem to be long-term effects of that, and that can be effects on mental and physical health, including difficulties with sleep. And on the other hand, we know that during pregnancy, sleep is really important to support the pregnant person's own health, but also we think the health of that developing child in ways that impact risk for depression and anxiety in the next generation. And that's what we're trying to do with the One Mind Project, is seeking to understand how one generation's experiences of adversity in childhood, things like abuse or neglect, impact their sleep in pregnancy and then that child's brain development.
So let's take the first piece of that, the relationship between early life adversity, define for us what that means, and the effect of the mom on the mom, and the adversity happened years before the mom got pregnant. So obviously you can't intervene necessarily with the adversity. How do you understand the effect on the mom in general and on her sleep, and how do you measure that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when we talk about childhood adversity, we're often referring to this sort of set of experiences, things like child abuse, child neglect, or severe dysfunction in the family. And that can be things like having a parent who's incarcerated, having a parent with serious mental illness, substance use, and those sorts of things. And we think about these experiences as experiences that when they happen in childhood, it's a very sensitive period when children are both psychologically developing a sense of what the world is like, who you can trust, and developing security and attachment, but also physically developing in terms of their stress systems and how their bodies are going to handle stress are also developing. And when you have these experiences come in, they sort of shake up a lot of those things. So what we and many people that have been doing this research have thought is that that may set off this sort of cascade. So for example, it may be that because you've experienced these things early on in life, your stress systems are dysregulated, if you will, and then stressors that you encounter down the road, like all of us will in life, you may react to them in an excessive sort of way that may then shift your physiology and your well-being and your mental health. And that can lead to sort of hypervigilance. And
so what's hypervigilance?
It's the state of like looking out for what could be wrong next. It's sort of, you're on the lookout to try to perceive within your environment the next threat. Because it may be that if you've had that early on in life, in a moment where, you're really dependent on a caregiver and the sort, then that sort of sets up the stage of just looking out for the next threat. And if you're hypervigilant or hyper-aware, it's pretty hard to go to sleep. And that just makes sense logically, but it also may be that stress hormones like cortisol, for example, that, you need that during the day to be alert, just function normally. But with that, if those cycles of, hormones that keep you alert in a healthy way don't regulate the way they're supposed to, that's going to impact your ability to sleep. So one of the things that we're looking at is melatonin. So we're looking at melatonin within pregnant people, and we're looking at how melatonin is it's a hormone naturally produced by the body, but it is critical to onset and maintenance of sleep. It tells our bodies it's lights out time to go to bed. And what we see is that, at night, that should be going up sort of as you're approaching bedtime. If that doesn't happen, you're just not going to feel sleepy or go to bed or be able to stay asleep. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And we're measuring that with a really fun measurement for the whole team, which is we stay up all night with participants and ask them every hour to collect a saliva sample so we can chart how that does. We also measure sleep using objective measures. We think that's really important. It turns out all of us in general are really bad at estimating how we sleep. The majority of us are really off. So we use these watches that are actigraphs, but they're sort of like Fitbits or an Apple Watch. And they tell us when this person is sleeping, how many times they awoke during the night, for how long, and the sort.
So when we're talking about early life adversity and the effect on the mom, are we talking about something like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is common, like 4% of the population? Or are we talking about something that affects even broader populations?
It's an excellent question. Not necessarily. So when we talk about PTSD, we're moving into a more clinical realm of a disorder that's sort of in reaction to an adversity. A lot of people will have many adversities and never have PTSD. So we're talking about something that maybe isn't as acute as PTSD, but maybe much more prevalent. So something like in the US, like 60% of all children have one of these adverse experiences before they turn 18. And a sixth of us will have 4 or more. So it's very prevalent. And it doesn't have to be PTSD, but it could lead to PTSD.
So but what we're talking about is, as you're saying, really, really broad, right? So it's relevant to a lot of folks at any given time who both have experienced a range of things early in life and end up pregnant, right? So then tell me what happens to the child. You talked a little bit about risk for various disorders like anxiety disorders. What happens? How early can you pick it up, and why are you focusing on the biology of the child's brain in the way that you are?
So what we think can happen is that if you have a pregnant person, like I said, who's not sleeping and then has a stress system that is, if you will, overactive, I'm simplifying, but or you have an immune system that isn't quite as working as it should, because that's another thing that sleep is very important for regulating. That developing fetal brain is actually being exposed to excess stress hormones, inflammatory agents, and the sort. And we think that could impact brain development really early on in life. We do methods like in the One Mind project that we're doing, we're using EEG or electroencephalography to look at electrical activity in that brain. And we're hoping to do it 1 month after birth. We also do sometimes MRI, and we do that in the same amount. And the reason why we use those techniques so early on in life is that I'm really interested in the prenatal world. And the theory here is if we look at that fetal brain using all of these techniques that we can right after they're born, we can sort of take a picture of like this moment in time without having the postnatal world influence that brain development. So we can make more claims about what happened in pregnancy and how that impacted. And we use those brain measures for one, because we really want to understand the circuits, right? Because that's how you know how to intervene. But also you can't quite ask a baby if they're anxious or stressed, right? So that's a way of us trying to understand really early risk. We then follow babies. So a lot of my work is longitudinal. We kind of hang out and wait for children to grow into an age when we can start seeing really early signs of it. So you're not going to see depression in a year and a half old, but you can see difficulties regulating emotion. You can see difficult or irritable temperament. And there's a whole host of studies that show that those sort of signs can be predictive of later risk for depression and anxiety.
So when you measure the baby's brain, what are you measuring?
In this particular case, we're looking at electroencephalography, right? So we're looking at activity within that brain, and we're looking at broad waves of activity. So we're looking at different frequencies of electrical activity within the brain, and we're trying to understand there's a particular measure that has been found to be predictive of risk for depression and anxiety, and it is when a specific frequency of waves, alpha waves, are stronger in one side of the brain than in the other side, when there's this asymmetry.
So you're measuring EEG, electroencephalography, in the baby's brain to learn about how it changes and how that predicts their own outcome. What are you measuring in that brain?
So EEG measures electrical activity within the brain. So we put little electrodes, which are just sort of like a recording little piece on the outside of the brain, and that picks up on electrical activity happening within the brain. And we just recorded the scalp level, different patterns of activity, if it's really fast, if it's really slow. And then we look for signals that we think predict depression or anxiety disorders in the future.
What have you found when you've looked at that so far?
So this is the first time that our lab is going to be looking at this age range. I used to do a lot of this work previously in 3 or 4-year-olds. And I saw things like when you have a child with difficulties regulating their emotion, frustration really impacts brain activity in a way that doesn't let that child focus on the task at hand. But again, we're doing that much younger in life now. So we're going to be looking at those patterns of activity in a 1-month-old. And we think that we're going to find that one side of the brain is actually doing a lot more than the other, which is what we call asymmetry. And that is a sign that other folks have found to be related to depressive and anxiety disorders.
Now, one of the other aspects of your project is, and perhaps even relevant also to how we measure things, is who we're measuring. And you're in particular targeting a population that's been under-measured and under-understood, which is the Latinx population.
Yeah.
Tell me what motivated that.
Well, for one thing, my own experiences. I am Puerto Rican. I grew up and raised Puerto Rico, did my undergraduate degree there, and a lot of my work still happens in Puerto Rico. So I work at Columbia University, but we work with Puerto Rican samples in New York because there's a large Puerto Rican population there, but also in Puerto Rico. So my work is really focused on trying to elevate this community that hasn't often been included in research, but is really interested in participating in research, has very high participation rates, and give these participants a voice via my research. And not just because that's where I come from, but because there are very large differences in sleep across different populations and in exposure to adversity. And we know that Latino families are more exposed to these adverse childhood experiences, and Latino people in general show poor sleep in the US. So we think that not only is it the right thing to do because everyone should be included in research if we wanted to reach everyone, but also this is a population that might be at a higher risk. So this research might be even more relevant to them. And that's why we do it.
So at a population at a higher risk suggests opportunities for intervention. Tell me about the various places that your research would suggest opportunities for intervention, and how would you measure that?
So that I think is one of the things that most motivates me about this research in particular is that in this particular study, we can intervene both in pregnancy. We can improve sleep in pregnancy. There's interventions out there that can maximize sleep. There's tons of things that we can do from very basic interventions like teaching people the best things to do if they want to get a good night's sleep, like turning off the phones before we go to bed, keeping to a regular schedule, to then more comprehensive interventions, even including to some extent pharmacological interventions or even melatonin, which is one of the mechanisms that we're looking at. But we can also intervene down the line. We're also looking at how infants sleep using the same technologies, and we can help parents help their children sleep better. So these are sort of very concrete places that our research can point to intervene. And we didn't pick them at random. We picked places where we knew there was potential for intervention. When we do our research, we often ask participants after they're done with the studies, what would you like to see? What do you think could help you? And our participants have tons of ideas of the things that could help them get a better night's sleep. So we're always doing the research with those things in mind.
How connected are these things? How predictive do you think the tools will ultimately be to go from knowing that a person has had trauma, which is, as you said, very common, to understanding how that plays out in their pregnancy, and then the likelihood that there's a negative outcome on the baby? I would think that as you make that tighter and tighter, that creates a really exciting opportunity for education, for really destigmatizing also by virtue of bringing the biology into bear so that the person understands what has happened to them and what is the effect on their baby.
Absolutely, absolutely. A couple of points related to that is when you said destigmatizing, I think that one of the things that drives me in this research is that when people have looked at adverse childhood experiences, sometimes the way it's talked about is about this inevitable sort of thing on your child. And no one wants to hear that that there's this destiny set out for them. What we can say is, no, we can stop that, right? If this turns out that we can interrupt this cycle, then we're sort of giving agency and hope to people in the sense that they can interrupt this very much.
Yeah, and that's important, right? Because if you're anxious about how your sleep impacts your baby, it's only going to worsen your sleep, which it's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle, yeah.
And the role in that case of the participants is actually quite powerful. How do you leave your participants at the end of a study in terms of what you explain to them about what it is that you studied, what you've learned, and how it relates to their babies' lives?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I've been doing for a while now is that we never end the study with our questions. We always do an open-ended interview where we ask about, what didn't we ask you that you thought was important to your experience? What was your experience in this study? If you could be a researcher and do this study, what would you do it about? Because sometimes, participants will let us know that's not the reason why I'm not sleeping, it's this one. So I think that's one, giving participants a voice, incorporating them in the design of the studies, and then we're moving on to an aspect where we're going to share the data back with the participants. And that can be in and of itself a form of intervention. So if we can tell a pregnant person, this is how much you're sleeping, or this is how much your child is sleeping, then we can find alternatives for them, and the research itself be an intervention. So that's sort of the things that we're trying to do.
Do you end up getting first-time moms or second, third, and so on babies?
We've been focusing on first-time moms because we all know that when there's another baby in the room, it's hard to sleep. So we've been doing first-time moms for the majority of these studies that require intense data collection. But ideally, another way of scaling this is by using larger samples with measures that are collected sort of easier, sort of like our iPhones actually can track when we sleep, when we don't. And those sorts of methods may be better for parents where there's a lot going on in the room, because then we want to bring it into the real world. Most people have more than one child, so that's really important too.
So where do you see this going for your own research?
At this moment, my research is building the blocks. We are tying up all of these things that were related, and we want to make sure that all these things pan out the way we do. But I'm anxious to start intervening. So the next thing that I want to do is start doing clinical trials where we intervene at maternal sleep health and see if we can interrupt that and show it in the next generation.
So it's a great transition, because people watching this are probably wondering, I'm not in the study, I don't have all these measures, I'm pregnant. What can I do to improve outcomes for my baby now?
So one of the things you can do is, there's tons of resources out there for how to improve your sleep. One of the things that you can do is, get a sense of, are you going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time the majority of the days? Keep electronics out of the room. Don't exercise too late in the night. Don't eat too late in the night. There's a lot of very simple things that you can do. The number one thing that I would say is, if you don't feel satisfied with your sleep, talk to your doctor. Talk to your OBGYN, talk to your primary care doctor. They can help with this.
And so much of it is people reaching out and asking for help.
Exactly. Ask for help.
So there's a lot of exciting work coming up in your project. Congratulations.
Thank you.
There's a lot of exciting work, it sounds like, that you've planned down the line that's really impactful. And it's been my pleasure here today to host Dr. Claudia Lugo-Candelas, One Mind Rising Star Awardee for 2023. Looking forward to seeing what the research holds.
Thank you.